Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Rob Moore has been on all four sides of the table. With decades of retail, political, communications, and agency experience in his back pocket, Rob brings a unique perspective to the table as a partner at one of Canada's top public affairs agencies, Crestview Strategy. From public policy to public opinion, get an insider look at modern government relations and how it impacts retailers. Learn about the changes that this line of work has undergone within the past decades and what Rob has to say about the digital campaigning and public opinion in government relations tradecraft today. Rob gives us his top 3 best pieces of advice for better understanding the political environment as it pertains to retail, and stick around for his hot take on Jagmeet Singh's TikTok account and other thoughts on our current and impending political climate, including the upcoming federal election call.
Are we quickly going to tell people they got to go back into stores to get certain things? Are we going to tell people they got to go to a doctor's office to get a prescription? Like, how much of that is going to be a predictable return? What's the pace of change now?
Let's listen in now. Rob, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast, my friend. How are you?
I'm well, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's so great to hear your voice. I think the last time you and I saw each other was at, not surprisingly, a pub in Yorkville. And but we first met at Hudson's Bay. Now that's probably in the late 90s, 2000s. I was launching HBC.com. We were doing all kinds of fun stuff back at Hudson's Bay. So I'm really excited and really happy to get you on the mic and talk about you and your perspectives. Let's jump right in. Tell the people about your personal professional journey. You've been on every side of the table I can imagine. You've been on the retailer side. You've been on the brand side. You've been on the political side in municipal politics, and now you're on the advocacy lobby side. So you bring such a rich perspective. Tell us all how that came to be.
So the origin story is all about politics, right? I have been in and around politics for my entire career, but rightly identified different sides of the table at different times. My retail component of the career is just by happenstance. It just was the circumstances in which I fell into Hudson's Bay Company early in my career, and then managed to do a stint at the Weston Corporation for Loblaws as well, and then actually did some time within a lottery and gaming corporation, a Crown Corporation, which let's face it, is really just a retail operation as well. It just so happens to be a monopoly, which if you ever get to run a business, monopolies are among the easier ones to run in the retail business. I highly recommend them.
Note to self.
Every time your market share remains the same, 100%. But no, I mean, I started my career in politics, working for politicians. It is something that I can't shake from, I don't use the word addiction because there are some that are more addicted to it than I am, but I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics. But early in my career, decided that it was a good thing to be a part of, but not a great way to make a living. And I left the world of working for a politician or in politics proper, and ended up working as a consultant. I went and worked for a large multinational called Edelman, as the director of public affairs for them in Canada. The first day I arrived coincided with them landing a big client, Hudson's Bay Company. So I had, as they say in the business, unsold time. So I got put to handed over to Hudson's Bay Company and became a consultant to them. And then when there was a leadership change among many during my time around Hudson's Bay Company, I was asked by incoming CEO George Heller at the time to join formally, and spent 6 years of my career as a vice president in charge of public affairs and all things that go with it at Hudson's Bay Company. Then left there, did a stint as a similar role at Loblaws. Left there, did a similar stint, as I said, at Lottery and Gaming Corporation. Did a bit of work after that was had me spending 2 years within the Rogers network, trying to put together a consortium to bid on the privatization of a large asset, and then returned back recently into consulting, and I'm now an owner and partner of a public affairs consultancy company called Crestview Strategy.
Would you advise listeners who either themselves or maybe they've got kids who are beginning their career journey is if they're interested in politics. And by the way, were you always interested in politics? Were you the guy around the sandbox trying to figure out who was, the leader and who was how to manipulate or how to figure out the politics of the play? Was that always you? Were you always a political person, so to speak?
Yeah, I didn't notice it until I realized it was something, and I probably realized it the most, in my time at HBC, where it was an interesting executive committee that I was fortunate enough to sit around the table. I didn't know much about retail. There were a lot of people around that table that knew a lot about retail. But what I knew that no one else knew was how to count the votes in the room, right?
You figured out the landscape. I mean, I was in some of those meetings. You figured out the landscape real quick. And it was a time of tremendous, as you said, tremendous change. And, people were, their stocks were trading up, down, or sideways at any given time. But
so that essentially is politics, right? Do you have the votes to do what needs to be done? So essentially, I didn't know that's what I was doing as a kid, but clearly it was, right? I was always assessing who was up, who was down. So that did become the central part of my career. And I enjoy organized and sort of formal politics, but it's not. So to answer your question more specifically, personally, if someone asked my advice, I'd be quite candid in it. Partisan politics is not my preferred method of practicing the art of politics. It's a pretty myopic, it is not a meritocracy. If the person across the table is wearing the same jersey as you, you have to work with them, whether they're good at what they do or not. So I quickly became less enamored of spending my time in organized partisan politics. And I have colleagues that I work with today who can't help themselves but see the world through a partisan political lens. And I don't think they're bad people. It's just I'd be quite clear to someone that wanted to spend a career in it, be careful. There's limitations when you identify yourself as, I will only ever work with people that think the way I think, because it's pretty limiting.
Is it, though, an important part of a career plan if you want to do the kind of work you do, and we're going to get into that at length a bit later? Is it important to sit in those meetings and be part of that to understand it? Just like, what do they call it? Regulatory capture. In other words, you want to be a civil servant to understand how the civil service works. In other words, to work with them better. Is that an important part? Would you advise people that if they want to go down this route, that it's not a bad time to spend a few cycles at that table? Yeah.
It's, two things that I always tell people is there's virtually no barrier to entry. Like if you want to learn more about banking or politics, you don't show up and volunteer at a DSIB or one of the six sister law firms, right?
Yeah.
But if you have an interest in politics, I could give you 3 numbers now of campaigns that would put you to work tomorrow, right? If you showed up. And that's how most people get their start. So there's no barrier to entry. And if you're good, you'll be given more the next day and the next day and the next day. Like there's a reason why the staff that serve, ministers and prime ministers and premiers, the average age is about 25, right? Because they've just been on a meteoric rise where they have, they will eat as much as they are fed, right? And that doesn't also happen. Like there are lots of careers you could choose. People are like, whoa, just slow down. It takes a little bit of time before you get to, touch the big toys. But that's not in politics. If there's no barrier of entry, and if you're good, you'll be given more responsibility in an exponential capacity than you would in other fields. It burns the shit out of you. It is not a healthy lifestyle. There are not a lot of healthy, happily married individuals that have spent 30 years in politics, right? It's just not. It's all consuming. You seek to be needed for every decision because that's part of your job is to make sure that no one makes a decision without you. So which is the conclusion I came to early, which is I'm getting out of this. I started to have a family, and getting home at a more predictable hour became more important to me than wanting to be the last one out of the office every night, which is sort of a hallmark of who really gives a shit in the political world.
Well, let's talk about your world now, Crestview Strategy. Talk about what that is and what really a modern government relations firm does. I mean, it's more than knowing the right people. It's more, that's important. It's more than understanding how politics works. That's important. But digital campaigns, influencing, what is a 360 degree look at your tradecraft feel like?
So I often describe it as, the currency of the realm was always relationships, who you knew, who you could call. And that the currency is diminished, but it is not gone, right? It is still a key component of how one operates in the public affairs space. But there have been some rapid changes, some of them just riding the coast of or the wave of technology and change, and how people gather and make decisions together is not the same as it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. But then there's been some rule changes, right? There's been some expectations of transparency. There's been some fundraising rules which have fundamentally changed the game. So I'm old enough to remember when you didn't have to register to lobby, when I would, at the time working for corporations like HBC or others, where you would hire lobbyists and they would essentially say, don't worry, I'll make the call, tell me what you need. And they would phone up and sort of say, okay, it's done, taken care of. Your brief has gone into the cabinet book, or the minister has your note and they're taking it home, or whatever it might be. Those days are gone, right? You can't do that anymore. You have to register if you're going to have a conversation with an elected official. You can't.
And that's anywhere, right? I mean, if you run into your local member of parliament or a minister in an airport, that has to be a registered conversation, right?
Correct. So not surprisingly, I have lots of friends who are elected officials, and we do the dance. Most times we run into each other, or something, which is, I never talk about a client, right? I never do, unless I'm registered, which I rarely am. I would just, as a matter of fact, never raise the topic, so that we both are comfortable to say we will not do it. Now, it's not a blanket regime. Different jurisdictions are different. There's federal, provincial, and municipal registries. Some are further ahead. Some are more forgiving. Some are, you're presumed guilty unless otherwise shown. It's not the same, but there is a general expectation. And we are a firm that I would say is on the newer side of firms in our space, meaning we're younger and we're growing, where we register to a fault. Like, we will always be transparent. We are zero risk in terms of you inevitably have a conversation a couple times a year with clients who are like, oh, come on, maybe they'll do a risk assessment that it's better not to register. And we go back pretty hard and say, you're absolutely wrong. The risk is in not registering. There is no risk in registering, right? Well, then people will know our business. It's like, trust me, just register. So that changed it. You used to be able to just, I bought a couple of tables at a dinner, or we're a large fundraiser that'll give us access to someone. Those days are all gone. That playing field has been leveled completely, where money doesn't play into it. So the practice has evolved. We organize ourselves around sort of four things, or we call them practices. Sometimes they're verticals, but they're really just sort of a flywheel of what needs to be done on a holistic campaign. And sometimes we do all of them, sometimes we do some of them. But one is just, you got to register and advocate for your clients' positions with elected officials. So that's the old school. You're a lobbyist. Your name shows up in the registry. You book the meeting. You go in. You meet with the officials straight up. That's still core to most campaigns. Then, as you identified, a growing part of our business is digital campaigns and mobilizing, which is understanding that the greatest impact you can have on elected officials is hearing an authentic voice from someone that votes for them, or may not vote for them, more pointedly. And the ability to find people that care about the issue that you want the elected official and their staff to care about is light years ahead of where it would have even been, again, 5-10 years ago, right? We can go into the, using all the tools available, find a community that really cares about a specific issue, and move them up an activist chain where, you start at the top of the funnel where you get them to see an ad and, I'm concerned about that. And then, if you get 100 of those by the end of a certain period of time, maybe 10 of them are like, I'm prepared to volunteer. I'm prepared to, testify in front of a committee. I'm prepared to write a letter. I'm prepared to put a sign on my lawn, whatever it is. You move them up that ladder, and that has changed our world significantly, because you don't just show up and say, we think as company Y, you should do this. They're hearing from authentic voices that are saying, we really care about this. This is going to impact something that's very important to me, and I'm a voter. That's the second part. The third part is, it's still telling the story. There's still a narrative component to how you persuade and how you change public opinion. It's less and less about earned media or sort of traditional media, but you still have to have people that understand communications and how you craft a message and how you prepare for a persuasion campaign that isn't about new and improved or new flavor this quarter or whatever it is. It is about something that is fundamental to people's opinion about you, whether your reputation is what you think it is, or you should be given access to a market, or you should be allowed to continue to exist within a regulatory framework. Whatever it is, you have to be able to communicate it. And the fourth piece of our business is really just about public opinion research and understanding how people think, because the days of saying, well, my instincts are, most people think this about psychedelics emerging as a legally expanded access in the marketplace. It's like, no, you don't know that. You need to go through some methodologies that actually tell you that. So those are the sort of four pieces of the pinwheel that all get applied to people that come and say, we need to address an emerging either risk or opportunity relative to what people think of us. And those people are going to have a say in whether we exist, whether we have access to a market, whether we get shut down, whether we're allowed to grow, so whatever it might be, there is some journey that requires them to go through a public opinion assessment of their point of view, and we call on any of those depending on what the circumstances require.
Is it also still the case that you would find yourself explaining unintended consequences?
Oh, 100%. That would be, if I was not being too glib, it's got to be a third, if not 50% of the starting point, right? And that's because, as I referenced earlier, some of my close friends are politicians, right? They're not bad people, but they have and they are led by officials that are generally well-meaning, that say, this is what we have to do. And you've got to go in there and go, I understand why you're doing that. We support your objective. But do you understand that by doing that, you are going to have these consequences down the market, down the chain, and you're not considering these people's point of view. And then you get into the straight up politics of, well, whose opinion matters more, right?
Yep.
And guess what? That's what politics is, right? My opinion is more important than your opinion. Let's duke it out. But a lot of it is unintended consequences, right? And most of it, Michael, quite frankly, comes to, and you would know this better than most, is because change has consequences, right? And when you have new market entries, when you have disruptive technologies, when you have ways of doing things that no longer require you to use the status quo delivery mechanism, or
you've had the great acceleration that COVID has brought in many industries, that what you thought in the before time isn't the way, may not be the way. We don't know all the implications of the COVID era. We know how many of us adjusted to the time, but we don't necessarily know the difference between what was an adjustment and what's structural change. I mean, that's the complicated, really complicated factor in many industries, I'm sure.
Yeah, and there is a gap between a growing gap, I would say, that we have noticed between consumer acceptance and sort of voter intent. Intent may not be the right word, but and we saw it really evident on the cannabis space, right? That the pace at which the government was moving on that file was glacial compared to where the consumer space was, right? And you had consumer offerings that were reacting to real time data and feedback about how customers wanted access, and that's not how government reacts, right? Government reacts to stakeholder impact and and they bring a very old lens to a lot of the stuff. So unintended consequences is both a shield and a cudgel, depending on who's paying me. Quite frankly,
I think. Would you agree that we saw some agility I've never seen before in governments with the COVID era? Everything from packaging to, you talked about cannabis. Suddenly in many jurisdictions, you could do home delivery in Ontario, for example. That happened literally overnight. You could do home delivery of beer. And we saw an agility that was heretofore unheard of, or am I imagining that? Is it?
No, there was a, and not to be too sort of processy about it. When you declare states of emergency or emergency orders, you can relax a lot of regulatory stuff that you couldn't do in normal times, right?
Or consultative stuff, right? Consulting with the people. Listen, we need to make a decision. This is the decision we need to make, and we're either going to pay for it with at the voter box, or we're going to win at the voter box, but we got to make a decision.
Yeah. So yes, a lot of stuff moved faster. We have represented the spirits industry for years, and they have always struggled around issues of access, entirely on reputational, right? Like that, you get beer and wine in grocery stores, access, and then when delivery became available, oh, fine, we'll allow beer and wine to be delivered, but spirits weren't covered. We were like, well, why not? And we got that changed very quickly. That was decades of being left out. That was very easy to change as a result of the circumstances and the pivots that some elected officials were making at the time. But you're right. I mean, I would be on the side that it's going to be tough for that stuff to go back, right? Like, I know you pay more when you go to one of your little wine shops or something in a high street or whatever it is, but it's going to be tough to tell them to shut down. That's not available anymore, right? Or some of these other changes that have occurred. I think you're right. There's going to be because the table,
even in healthcare, right? I mean, it wasn't the case, and we're both in Ontario. It wasn't the case in Ontario where you could have a doctor's appointment on a Zoom call and get a prescription renewed. Which is when you do it now, you're like, it's the model of efficiency, but it suddenly happened overnight. I mean, I'm sure there's like 10 committees who argued for 50 years about that, but then it happened, and it's hard to see going back.
I bought a property over this, and it was like, you would have had to go into the lawyer's office and sign 19 documents. And it's like, oh, I had a 10-minute call with my real estate lawyer, and I owned it, right? And well, what kind of scam were you pulling on me for the last few times I had to do it, right?
Shifting gears a little bit, what do companies and their leaders get wrong when they seek to influence or somehow impact public policy? I mean, as you know, I spent many years at the Retail Council of Canada, so I have some notion of working with or representing industries. As you said, you were with Hudson's Bay and Loblaw. It used to be that in fact many, let's say retailers, even very big retailers, didn't even see a role for advocacy. They thought it was just an unnecessary expense. But then I think they felt then that the story was being told to them versus their influence. But what do they get wrong? Is it trying to understand what they can accomplish and how much influence? But you tell me, what often are you in the meeting and saying, listen, that's you're not quite thinking about this right. What are those things? Yeah,
and I'll be a little more fair in my negative assessment, and that it's on both sides of the table, right? And I've often used the analogy that because I have sat on both sides of the table, right? So I've served politicians, I've served CEOs. You go into meetings. The analogy I use is that it's sort of like you sit down and one group is speaking Portuguese, the other speaking Spanish. That if you're not really paying attention, it sounds like the same language, but the other one has no idea what the other person's saying, right? So what do? They just kind of yell louder, or they make their case more emphatically, not understanding that they are speaking sort of different. They're speaking about different value sets. They're speaking about different metrics and predictors. And that although those worlds intertwine all the time, I'm still amazed. And I tell the story. I wrote a strategic proposal for the government of Ontario on the privatization of their gaming assets. And I would go into some private equity guys or some sort of financial leaders in the community that were trying to understand the valuation of certain properties that may or may not have been made available by the Crown. And you go in and they would demonstrate you just got to move these assets here. And he's like, well, you can't do that because it's in this riding, and you can't do that because of, and they would have no comprehension of not looking at a profit and loss or a balance sheet statement, and understanding value is just it's a numerative exercise. There is no other consideration around what the value of something is other than that. And then I would go and speak I'd go down and make a presentation on what I learned to the Minister of Finance, and I'd put up something and demonstrate the valuation of an asset. And I'll never forget one day a senior official in the government, like in finance, I put a slide up and they go, what is a CAGR? What is a CAGR? And I'm like, a CAGR? It's a compound annual growth rate. It's a pretty significant measurement you should understand when evaluating assets in the private sector. And I'm like, and you write budgets for the government? And you realize neither side really understood the other one's point of view, right? Yeah. So what is it? Is that you really have to take a step back, and which is not easy to do for high-powered business leaders, right? Because as you and I know, we've served the CEOs. Not a lot of people tell them no, right? Right. Not a lot of people say, no, let me explain this to you differently, right? Because they are rarely challenged. And the same happens with the minister, right? Where they're like, no, my world is the world that matters. And there is a real sort of conflict that you have to diffuse before you go in, right? Like I had a CEO that I worked for years that would go into a meeting with a minister and each time would say, okay, what is the sale? What order are we getting out of this meeting? I'm like, that's not the way it works. And they're like, every meeting is a transactional meeting. And I'm like, not in politics. Right. You may say something that comes up 3 meetings later that has to do with this, like it's a different game. And they'd be like, no, you don't understand. Everything has to end in a transaction. That's how the world works. Yeah. And the CEO got fired by the minister 6 months later, right? And it's like, see, it doesn't work that way.
The two worlds don't always meet, right? I mean, Donald Trump was often described as a very transactional leader. He just moved from transaction to transaction to transaction without really encompassing a strategy. But it was, I won here, it was win-lose. I win here, and then let's move on. And that kind of transactional approach just, doesn't foster good public policy, I don't think. But it is something different to understand, right? It's not a transaction. It's more iterative than that, right?
And so people are getting better at it. In terms of, to answer your question more specifically, business leaders, there is a translation component where they listen more often, where they understand that there are aligned interests. They're not always competing interests. You just need to find a way to align yourself with that. Things like mandate letters from governments are much easier now. So every minister gets handed a mandate letter. Those are made public. So you can go in and articulate your ask or what you're advocating for in the language of something that is in the minister's mandate letter. So there are ways to align interests. And that's what people like I do. They say, if you're going to ask for, A, it's not going to be a good meeting. But if you kind of present the scenario where B and C actually equal A at the end of the day, we may have more success. And that's what good consultants like us do. And it is getting better and more listening. But the simple answer to your question is those that go in and expect that their job is to tell government what to do rarely goes well.
Will be less successful. Do you think the COVID era, I mean, it has been a very highly charged political environment of this intersection between politics and business and life. Is there an upside to this? In other words, when the bread fell off the breakfast table and landed butter side up, that businesses have a better appreciation of governments? Or do you think we'll come out of this better informed collectively between governments and business? I mean, or do you think we'll move the same or worse?
I think my answer, which sounds like a political answer, is, it depends who you're talking to, right? There are such important sectors of the economy that just got the shit kicked out of them, right? Yeah. And I assume they're not sitting there thinking they were thought of or looked after or they're that elected officials were nimble in appreciating what they needed. But then there's some businesses that adapted well, and by sheer luck because of what their offering was. So I think they'll all react differently, right? Like I talk to people all day long about politics, usually at the beginning and end of calls, because they always want to kibitz about it somewhat.
Like this one. This one. Yeah.
Outside of their issue. And, there's a pocket of people in the province of Ontario that are absolutely livid with Doug Ford, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not a partisan assessment. That's just he totally messed this up, right? Yeah. And I don't think they are emerging out of this with a belief that this all went okay and we're doing fine, right? I think there's some pockets of resentment that we're yet to understand as we emerge from this. And that's just the opening and closing. Like, could I get a haircut or go to my gym kind of anger, or are my kids going to school or not, up yo-yo kind of thing. But we haven't got to the sort of we've totally suspended the financial the financial management assessment that is one of the key contributors when people make decisions about their federal government, right? Are they good stewards of the public purse? God, there's so much money that's flown out. I don't know how they turn the taps off. I don't know. Like, that's a whole other exercise that's yet to be understood.
Maybe the stockpile, as it's been described, right? This massive consumer stockpile of dry powder from consumers is going to pull us out and the economy out. It's certainly having that effect in America. I mean, the NRF has projected, the National Retail Federation has projected 13% growth year over year. It's just
that's absurd. Can you imagine that? Jeez.
And that's on a multi-trillion-dollar retail business, and it's just it's pulling out of the we'll see where it is a year from today. That's a whole different conversation. Speaking of which, so in all your conversations with leaders, what are their top concerns with retailers and brands now that the COVID era is finally winding down? The dialogue's a bit less about what the rules are and how to operate. But what coming out of all this? What are their top concerns? What's so to speak keeping them awake at night that they talk to you about and get your wise counsel on?
Probably falls into a couple of categories. One is just a general feeling of instability, right? In that we are a country that is uncomfortable with minority parliaments, right? We don't kind of work well with them, even though we've had quite a few in the last 20 years or so. And there is an appetite for certainty. There's an appetite for, I think some of that may be just the result of the last 4 years in the U.S. when you had nothing you could count on from that partner. There's just a general, and then the pandemic. Like, there's just a general. Can we please go back to something predictable in our public sphere, right? Which is just general, right? That's not that's nothing specific. That's just a general. Can't we please return to
what normal looks like?
But boring kind of politics, right? Like the politics that we knew, where you knew this guy was going to do this and this woman was going to do that if elected. Like, it's all kind of disruptive. And that's generally kind of what they talk about. But the other part is, and you've alluded to it a couple times and would know more about it, is the pace of change that was accelerated as a result of this. How much of that was a factor of circumstance? Like the fact that, I don't know what the number is, but how many people in the GTA ate restaurant meals in the last 18 months, and how many of those will return to eat them at a restaurant, and how many will continue to have those delivered? How many will actually go to, there was a period where there was retail shut down in Ontario for so long. There must be some statistical thing about, people needed underwear and socks. They had to get the underwear and socks somewhere, right? And where do they get them from? Well, that changed the behavior. And how much of that behavior changed was a sort of push into a technology that was always latent because it was based on consumer preference. But are we quickly going to tell people they got to go back into stores to get certain things? Are we going to tell people they have to your point, they got to go to a doctor's office to get a prescription? Like, how much of that is going to be a predictable return? What's the pace of change now? That's the second part that seems to keep them up, and an unclear view that government should do something about that, right? Like some kind of general, get off my lawn kind of. This was all an anomaly. We're going to go back to the way the world used to work, right? Where to our conversation sort of leading up to this about conferences and other things, right? Like, is that all just going to come back, or is everyone going to perpetually talk on Zoom calls all the time, right? Like it's that's the second part of it is trying to assess the pace at which some of this stuff is just locked in and never going back. How much of it is going back, and what role does government have in changing that? I mean, we did some work early on in the ride sharing space, right? And the resistance that came to in the ride sharing space because of the status quo industries that were going to be hurt. That sentiment isn't the same as it used to be, right? The protection for status quo has been somewhat weakened as a result of the fact that all of our lives changed and we relied on different mechanisms of commerce and connectivity. And how much of that is going to come back, who knows? And that seems to be another factor that worries business leaders, particularly in those that have, B2C businesses.
I've been referring to it as the powerful regression to the mean phenomenon.
Yeah.
How many people will just pick up after 18 months of what Roger Martin called, the biggest circuit breaker on consumer behavior since the Second World War. It's funny because if you and I were sitting together and saying, boy, if we had 6 weeks of this, everything would change. Well, we've had 18 months of it. And yet, this weekend I looked at lines from retailers you and I know, and there are lines around the block from people who wanted to go shop them. So it's the powerfulness of this regression to the mean on top of this disruption in our lives. And that disruption is not over either, by the way, as we know. Well, listen, I can't have you, as you kind of alluded, I can't have you on the podcast without tapping into a bit of your political wisdom. Who's the best communicator around from at the federal level? I see Jagmeet's got a TikTok channel that's just blowing up. He's really good at it. Is that going to win him the next election? Is there going to be thinking that there's going to be an election call? Is the Trudeau government going to try and lock in the gains, whatever they may be, from managing the COVID era? How do you see the landscape? Do you see that kind of, we need change and this is an opportunity versus let's just lay low and, we got a new governor general today, so a little progress here, a little progress there. How are you guys seeing it?
Well, we're into one of the predictable parts of politics that I now recognize, having been doing this for so long, which is we're into the when, not if, federal election timing watch, because there's like 5 people that actually know the timetable that this federal government is following with respect to dropping the writ, and they're not talking, right? So it has really tightened up. So the rumor mill, the speculation is now filled with those that don't really know, but that's a sign that we're getting closer because those that do know are holding their cards much closer to the chest because they're past the point of kind of thinking out loud about it. They're looking at the timetable, and there's a date. There's 4 people, maybe it's 5 people that know the date. It's in a calendar. It might change, but it's in a calendar, and they've started to build the campaign around that, and that's going to happen. As soon as it may happen as soon as this month, but definitely before the end of the summer, leading to an election. We are going to have a federal election in the next 3-4 months. I don't think, unless
no doubt in your mind about that.
Unless something unforeseen happens, that all signs point at the governor general, even the prime minister shaving his beard off because he's doing commercials now, right? Like it's all they're all tea leaves that read to we're going. The fact that the Parliament, when Parliament rose a couple of weeks ago, they did the traditional thing where those that aren't returning were given a last speech. We don't do that if you're coming back to pass more legislation.
Yeah,
right? Like,
that's interesting. Yeah.
There's all kinds of.
And then you had the opposition leader, taking a stand on Canada Day, which looked very much like positioning around setting in where's the positioning going to be for the big runoff, right?
Yeah, no, and they're all jockeying now, and that's I think I think Jagmeet wins the social game, hands down. I think he looks natural in it. He's exceptionally good on the small screen, right? Like he pops on all those platforms. I think it's authentic to him. I don't think he looks like someone had to hold the camera for him and explain to him what it is, right? I think that's all good.
It's the old jet. It's the old not the guy on the jet ski.
Correct. Example. Yeah, it's Stockwell Day.
Stockwell Day on the jet ski.
No, I think he's. But I would struggle to handicap to assess him as going to make great gains this campaign. I just don't see him resonating. I mean, if I had to, you're asking me to predict, so I'll predict. I think we're into the potential of a liberal majority with a likelihood of a minority liberal if there's some vote splits in certain communities that go a certain way. The things that really upset that would be a performance by Jagmeet that swept the Lower Mainland and took a bunch of BC seats. Something weird happening in Quebec where I don't think they're ever going to embrace him, and he's going to make a breakthrough there like Jack Layton did. I'm not a friend or enemy of Aaron O'Toole, but I think I can make the dispassionate assessment that he just hasn't caught on, right? Like he just has not connected. And that party really struggles to find a mainstream voice. And the moment they kind of look like they're hitting that stride, they get pulled back in by certain parts of that party that make it awfully difficult for them to appear like they're looking to a candidate that looks different than the one that they embraced that was 20 years ago, right? And that I think Canadians feel that. And my last sort of assessment of that is to answer your first question. I don't know how he's done it because he's been in the public eye forever and has been prime minister for a long time, but he has some ability to exceed expectations as a communicator. And the prime minister is the most effective communicator of those national leaders. That is somewhat, it's a different perspective because we've kind of seen him forever, but he still looks kind of fresh faced and leaning forward into a future that we all believe in, which is an awfully tough act to pull off after you've been in power for 6 years, right? And I think there's pockets of Canadians that understand who he is and are still voting for him, right? Like I think all the scandals that he endures all come back to some kind of out of touch elite accepted, that they're like, well, yeah, we know he's that, right? We know he thinks he's better than us, and maybe that's because he is a little bit, right, or something like that. And it doesn't seem to move voting behavior significant. Now that being said, they could run the last two campaigns they've run have been very good. The Liberals. Yeah.
They've lost a few MPs have retired, right? A few ministers retired. Yeah. They got some change on the benches for sure.
Yeah. And they've lost good ones, right? They've lost, good ones, both in they were competent ministers.
And electable.
But also spoke to their brand, right? Catherine McKenna leaving is is a signal of something that is counter to what they want us to think about that place, right? And how they operate. I don't think, and that may be it. Listen, I spend way too much time paying attention to this, but I think it speaks to a larger, it's the old adage that if you have to tell the world you're a feminist, maybe you're not as much of a feminist as you think. Why don't you just do it? And therefore you don't have to tell us you are, right?
Yeah. Well, there's lots of issues that we would have liked to see, I think, more progress on that hasn't had. So it'll be interesting to see the policy and the platforms and the run up. And as you say, after 6 years of saying, I'm going to do something and nothing's been done, will they be called to task for that? Or, now last quick question, same question. We're in Ontario, but lots of the provinces have changed leadership. A couple of big provinces, Alberta and Ontario, both have had deep questions about their leadership from the population. It sounds like we're going to have an election in Ontario, where you and I are the biggest province. Any thoughts on that? I mean, as you alluded before, there's some visceral dislike of our current premier because of some decisions made. But will that pass, and will they overlook that to put him back in that chair? What do you think?
He is such a unique political character that it's hard to predict.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I wouldn't predict that he would have been our premier 5 years ago. That's for sure.
No, you wouldn't have predicted he would have won the leadership. You wouldn't have predicted he'd be the premier.
Yep.
Listen, you wouldn't have predicted his brother would be the mayor, right? Like they are an unpredictable political family, to say the least. He reminds me of my famous, the famous Richard Nixon quote that the most important thing in politics is authenticity, and once you can fake that, you've got it made. Right? Like he is an authentic dude. Like there's not much more there than what you're seeing, and at the end of the day, that gets him through a lot.
Yes.
Now there are a lot of forces opposed to him, right? None of which is certain parts of his caucus are very angry. He's not one of them, right? Like he's not in the trenches, spent my time around Queen's Park, know these people well, sat on committees with them. Like he doesn't have a lot of friends around the cabinet table or the caucus. The Liberal machine is still a machine, even though they're the rump of a party. They still represent the natural governing party of this province, so they're not going anywhere. And then there's lots of money out there to defeat him, right? Between teachers and others that, I would not count him out. But I think the predictors of whether he'll be elected again have yet to sort of materialize, particularly, as you said earlier, the dry powder. Like if the economy comes roaring back and everyone's feeling pretty good and, kids get back to school and, all kinds of things start to bounce the right way, then, he might win another majority,
Well, I mean, if you and I were sitting together in February, we wouldn't be saying that Canada was leading the world in vaccinations either, right? So a lot can change. A lot can change pretty quickly. So listen, Rob, this has been such a great conversation. Long overdue, and your perspectives for the listeners and your perspective on the podcast, much appreciated. And I wish you much continued success. And how can people get in touch with you or learn more about Crestview?
Crestviewstrategy.com. Look us up.
Great email, by the way. I subscribe to an email that you guys send out for provincial and federal. It's fantastic. Just the updates are great. Just
lots of updates. You can go on there and pick. We have an office in the UK. We have one in Washington. We got a perspective on Alberta, BC. Like you can pick and choose. We won't fill your mailbox with stuff you don't want. But if there's
it's really good
perspective, we like to give political perspective. So if you want it, we'll give it to you.
All right. Well, Rob, thanks again for being on the Voice of Retail. Real treat after so long catching up. And once again, I wish you continued success. And maybe we'll circle back closer to when the writs drop on both sides and get your perspective closer to the day. But until then, have an amazing summer. And I wish you well and good health.
Thanks, Michael. This is a pleasure. And call anytime. Nice to catch up with you. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc., and if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at emmyleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe, have a great week.